Ladies and gentlemen, after a long hiatus, this is the Gray Knight returning. Um, I'm going to start posting videos again, largely because I feel like I need to. Um, I've been listening to a lot of videos by YouTuber Tim Pool, and I have a lot of respect for Mr. Pool. I don't always agree with him, but I will say I think he's got his finger on the pulse of some things. And he raised a really valid point that I basically can't argue with about speaking out if you object to what's going on. And I mean, he's put it in pretty good language in one of his most recent posts, and I'm going to link to that in the description of this video. And I think he's kind of hitting on the head, something on the head that shouldn't be anything new to us. It goes back to an old quote by Edmund Burke, uh, which is to say that all it takes for evil to flourish is for good men to do nothing. Um, I'm going to start posting some videos and talking about some of the things that are going on. One of the things I'd like to talk about, because I think it's an important point, is the presidential election and the candidates. Specifically, I'm going to start by talking about Mr. Biden, Joe Biden. Um, I don't think, and I want to be clear about something when I use the Edmund Burke quote. I don't believe that Mr. Biden is an evil man. I think he means well to the extent he knows what the hell is going on, and that's going to be a topic for another video. But I think in meaning well, he could create an evil inadvertently because I think the policies he's pushing are just really not a good thing for this country. And Mr. Poole had put it in its terms of if you're not going to speak out against it, then you are acquiescing. And I think that's a valid point. Um, I have some serious issues with Mr. Biden's policy proposals and with Mr. Biden as a candidate. As I say, I think he means well to the extent he knows what's going on. I also think that he would not make a good president. Now, I will say I'm not a fan of Mr. Trump either. I think he has not been the worst president we've had, but he isn't somebody I would say is a brilliant president or a brilliant leader. I think he is a reasonable placeholder to be really direct about it. In other words, he's a butt in a seat, and as a butt in a seat, he's taking a seat that someone else might take and do harm with. Um, so, Mr. Biden, to start with, I think for today's topic is going to be. I want to talk about Mr. Biden's environmental policies, or more specifically, his policies for climate change. Um, the page I have up here, this is factcheck.org, and this is talking about the Green New Deal. Now, the Green New Deal was originally proposed by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as a response to climate change and some other issues that she was concerned about. But for the purposes of this video, I really want to focus on the climate change proposal. Um, I think it's ambitious. I'll give her that. I also think it is, how do I put this nicely? Uh, Fanciful. Naive would be the words I think would best describe it. Um, I think it's a fanciful, naive policy made by people who have no idea how a lot of America lives, to be blunt. Um, I am going to try very hard to keep a logical and neutral tone with these videos. I don't want to devolve into emotionalism. I think that is not helping the situation right now. I will also tell you that I have a particular viewpoint on this. I have some pretty strongly held beliefs. Um, and I will be direct that I do oppose the Green New Deal, and I oppose a lot of the measures that are being proposed as a way of enacting the Green New Deal. Um, I have a specific reason why I oppose it, and it is because I believe it is unworkable, and I believe that it is um, attempting to enact radical changes to the way we conduct our very lives in a short period of time and in a manner that is not realistic for a lot of America. And is, I believe, if it's done the way they're talking about, I don't think it is. I don't think it's hyperbole to say it could represent an existential threat to some Americans. And yes, I can hear people saying I'm being alarmist. If that's what you think, fine. I can back up what I have to say, though. Let's talk about this. So, the Green New Deal calls for achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions. What does net zero mean? Basically, they're saying that no greenhouse gas emissions, which is going to, in effect, mean no fossil fuels. And I will say that in describing, in actually making hard policy proposals, although I disagree with him, I respect Bernie Sanders' honesty because he came right out and said this means putting a moratorium on recovering new oil, natural gas, coal. It means a hard ban at some point in the not too distant future on the internal combustion engines that run on these fuels. I think the problem with that is obvious, but I'm going to kind of break it down for you. Mr. Biden's proposed something a little bit less hardline than that on its face. You know, when you look at his webpage and what they're discussing, a lot of it has the appearance, and this is his webpage, by the way, just so you know, I actually did read this. I mean, it's very wordy. It's a lot. It's very, very heavy on style without a lot of substance, in my opinion, of how to pay for things and how to get things done. He talks about tax credits. He talks about putting the cost of greenhouse gas emissions on the polluters. He talks about higher emissions regulations on automobiles and on offering tax credits to people to buy electric cars. I would read this, although he hasn't come out and said this, based on what he supported in the past, and when he was vice president under President Obama, excuse me. I'll show him the honorific. I'm not one of his fans, but I'll show him the honorific. President Obama. So Mr. Biden and President Obama were attempting to pass cap and trade. Cap and trade basically was a plan. Again, let's be careful with the language. A plan whereby companies that emit carbon, such as the electric company, just as a for instance, would have to buy carbon credits and would get so many, and if they needed more, they'd have to buy more, and it would be traded. The most obvious effect of this is that it's an additional expense to these companies, and that was the design. It was supposed to create a financial incentive for them to change their ways of polluting. The problem with this approach is when you were talking about carbon-heavy industries, such as electrical generation, petrochemicals, oil, fuel refining, things like that, there's only so much that can be done with modern technology. And the rest of that is going to be money out of someone's pocket. Normally, the way these companies do that is that it's going to mean that you, as the consumer, get to pay more. Now, there's an obvious problem with this as well. Let's just talk about the electric company for a second. The electric company as it stands now, electricity is expensive. I'll use myself as an example. From my place of business, an electric bill is about $100, and you're gonna, on average per month, 100 to 150, depending on the time of year. And I know you guys are going to say, "Oh, that's nothing, pocket change." It's not pocket change for me. I mean, I can pay it, but it's not pocket change for me. If my electric company suddenly had a new expense and my electric bill goes up, or what was the language that Mr. Obama used? I believe it was electric rates will necessarily skyrocket. I may not be able to pay that bill. And with no electricity, my business is dead in the water. My home electric bill runs between about $50 and $100. Again, depending on the time of year, tends to get expensive in the summertime. I live in an area that gets pretty hot in the summer, and air conditioning is a necessity. So you run the AC, the electric bill's higher. Um, anyway, for a lot of us, myself included, we can just about afford that bill along with the others that you have to pay. If it doubles or triples or whatever because of carbon of cap and trade, the result is going to be having to make that rather undesirable decision of, do I pay this bill or do I pay some other bills, or do I pay this bill or do I buy food? Do I pay this bill or do I buy medicine? I mean, it's a big deal. And that's just one facet of this problem. Cap and trade will affect the cost of gasoline because you want to make gasoline, it's a carbon heavy endeavor. Um, price of gasoline is a huge problem. Mm, and I think one of the problems is the ones making the policy don't understand this. They see a car as a luxury. I think certainly Miss Ocasio-Cortez sees it that way. And given where she grew up and where she lives, and given the fact that she is now an extremely wealthy woman, for her it probably is a luxury. She's out of New York City. Um, New York City and that area has exceptionally high quality public transportation. Um, something to be aware of, guys, and I mean no disrespect to Miss Ocasio Cortez in saying this, nor do I mean any disrespect to Mr. Biden, or for that matter, Mr. Trump. You guys don't live like most Americans do. If you, I mean, for Miss Cortez, it's easy to say, oh, just take mass transit, take commuter rail, take a bus. In middle America, there isn't commuter rail, and there may not be a bus. The car is a necessity for us. You want to get to work, you're going to drive. You want to get to the store, you're going to drive because you're probably not going to be able to walk. I do about a 40-minute commute to my business. Moving closer isn't an option for a variety of reasons, which are outside of the scope of this discussion, but it's not an option for me. I have to commute. So, there's no bus, there's no train. I get in the car and drive, or I don't go. And it's too far to walk, it's too far to take a bike. If I was to walk, I'd have to start the night before. If I was to take a bike, I'd probably have to start the night before. It's that far. Um, for someone to say that, well, just give up your car, well, if I give up my car, I'm giving up my job with it. My wife's in the same problem. Again, cannot walk, must drive. And, there's no other options. Um, you take away our car, you ban it because of these or you run the expense of it up high enough that we can't afford to use it is the other possibility, because that's the immediate effect of what Mr. Biden has proposed. It will significantly increase the cost of gasoline, without a doubt. We've been lucky in recent times, then the gasoline's relatively cheap. And here it's less than $2 a gallon. That's not that bad. I'm old enough to recall under Mr. Obama when it was like nearly $4 a gallon. Actually, it was over $4 a gallon, excuse me. It got close to 5. Filling up my car at the time was about $60, and I wasn't driving an SUV. In fact, the car I had didn't even have that big a tank, and it was a piece of crap car. But it gets very expensive. That is a problem. If you have to commute, it's a real problem. That can add up very quickly, and again, it can get to the point of, well, do I want to buy lunch today or put gas in the car? Oh, I need to get to work. Gas. So you find yourself as a working adult skipping meals. As I said, my car is not an option. My wife's car is not an option. And with all due respect to our leaders in Washington, they have no clue. They are wealthy enough that $5 a gallon is a drop in the bucket to them. They're wealthy and they live in places where there is good mass transit. Washington has decent mass transit. Um, not that any of these people would be using it, but they can look around and say, "Oh, look, there's the train. Why are you driving when you can take the train?" Is my point. They have no clue. I would invite any of them to come to Middle America, and I ask this question with absolute high respect, but I believe that these folks are ignorant and need to be educated. Come to Middle America, work a 9 to 5 here, or work a professional job if you want to work a professional job. You know, come to Middle America. Come to any of the states there. You know, Kansas, one of the Dakotas, Oklahoma, Texas, any of those places. Not in the cities, just so I'm being clear. You know, like those either suburban or rural areas. You work a 9 to 5, you work a professional job, and you tell me and live here for a month, and then you tell me how we're supposed to get around and get to where we need to be in an efficient and timely manner, and in a reasonable manner, because I'm not even getting into the issue of weather. Let's just say it's a reasonable amount of time without our cars. Now, Mr. Biden might, the answer, of course, would be, well, we're not saying you can't have a car. We're saying you can't have a gasoline-powered car. So let's talk about that for a second. Mr. Biden proposes offering tax credits. Laudable, I guess, but it comes with an inherent problem, and this is it. Tax credit assumes you have the money up front, or the credit if you don't have cash. Because most people don't pay cash for cars, they buy it on credit. You have the cash or the credit to get a new vehicle. Not a used vehicle, a new vehicle. And a more expensive new vehicle. A lot of these electric cars, the sticker price is higher than a comparable gasoline car. And cars these days are running around 30 grand. So this assumes you have money to pay for that. And that, and then get it credited back to you later. It assumes you have money to make that monthly payment on. You have good enough credit to get a loan, and enough money monthly to make the payment on the car to keep that up. I'll use myself as an example. I don't have money to replace my car. I own my car outright. I don't have a car payment. I have my car because I was lucky enough that I found a good deal that I could afford. I'm not a wealthy guy, and I can't just plunk down 30 grand on a new car. I can't. And the tax credit really doesn't help me because it doesn't put cash in my hand now. I'm not even going to get into how you're going to pay for the tax credit. I'm just telling you, as a practical matter on the ground, this is a huge problem. And it just shows a lack of understanding by our leaders as to what these kind of policies will do. They talk about global climate change as an existential threat, and this particular ball has been hit around the tether a number of times. It was Al Gore was throwing it around when he was running against George W. Bush. And I think the promise then was like 2010 or 2011. It was going to be catastrophe if we didn't do something right then. Well, it's 2020. And we're all still here. And even though this has been an absolute dumpster fire of a year, for the most part, we're still alive from COVID. It screwed things up royally, and for some people it was deadly, but human civilization trucks on. The weather is nasty, and it gets hot in the summer, it gets cold in the winter. We've seen some pretty brutal storms, but again, human civilization trucks on. I haven't, going on history, this global climate change thing is not an existential threat going on history. We're still here. Um, Actually, COVID caused more disruption than any of these storms. Um, my point is, it may indeed be a threat, but this is not like the apocalyptic threat they want us all to believe. You start passing laws that are going to take a carbon based economy, a carbon based infrastructure that has been built up for over 100 years. So, if you really want to look at this, we started using coal back in the early Industrial Revolution, which was in about the mid 1800s. That's when it was coal. It is now the 2020s. I mean, it's well more than 100 years later. We're going on 200 years later. And that's how long the current infrastructure has been built up. And they're proposing to completely tear down everything that there is now that's dependent on carbon and replace it with essentially the proposals I hear are wind and solar. There's been some farting around on the Democrat side with nuclear, but most of them seem to be opposed to that. And you want to do this in what is, in terms of industrial development, the blink of an eye. That will be an existential threat to some of us. For those of us who need our cars and aren't wealthy and don't have the option of replacing it with an electric car, it is, that is absolutely devastating. I want to talk about something else too. Is assume you can buy the electric car. That's still not necessarily a solution either. I don't know if these guys are aware of this or not. I don't know how many of my listeners are aware of this or not. There are electrical shortages in some parts of the country now. California has done rolling blackouts for years because of summer electrical shortages. Between the demands of Silicon Valley and the demands of people running the AC, they have rolling blackouts. What does that mean? Well, it basically means that you may or may not have power. That's based on current electrical supply. I mean, I'm not even talking about adding anything to the demand or cutting the supply in any way. Most of our electricity in this country is still generated using either fossil fuels or nuclear. A lot of it's being generated with natural gas, fair amount by coal, some by nuclear. And then some by hydroelectric, some by wind, some by solar. They want to do away with coal. They ultimately want to do away with natural gas. They don't like nuclear and want to do away with that. And they don't really like hydroelectric either because it dams up rivers and screws with the fish or something like that. So eventually they're going to be going after the dams. The net result of this is that you reduce the supply of electricity. Now, against the current demand, that's going to cause problems. But then they want to turn around and add the transportation sector onto the electric grid. That'll never work unless you figure out a way to increase the supply of electricity, because you're basically trying to add demand while cutting supply. And you can argue all day long about more windmills and more solar panels, but there's an inherent problem with both of those technologies. And that is that they are not always on technologies. If the sun's not shining because there's clouds in the sky, you're not going to get much electricity out of a solar panel. Don't take my word for it. You can buy small solar generators on Amazon. They're not expensive. I think it's a good thing to have around the house because they do have their uses. I took mine camping with me a couple months ago. It was a great little thing. And when the sun's out, you don't even really have to worry about draining down the battery because it balances out pretty well when the sun's out. And that's the problem. You want to take that out in the wintertime when it's cloudy, in a place where it's cloudy a lot, like say you live up in the Northeast, up in New England, or you live in the Northwest, where the wintertime it's cloudy as hell, and you may not see the sun for a while. That solar technology isn't so helpful. You get the same limitation with wind. If the wind's not blowing, you don't have electricity and you're dependent on batteries. Batteries, by the way, generating those batteries will generate carbon because modern high capacity batteries depend on rare earth minerals like lithium, which have to be mined. And the mining process involves the use of heavy machinery that, lo and behold, generates carbon at present. If you go away from using diesel power, well, then you need something electric, but you're going to need a lot of electricity to power those machines. And that's assuming you can build an electric motor that's as powerful as a diesel engine, which is arguable. So it's an inherent problem. Another problem that I haven't talked about yet, and it's a problem with either the ban the internal combustion engine scenario or the cap and trade scenario. Food. Modern food production is heavily dependent on carbon. Everything, cattle and other livestock produce carbon emissions just by living. And that was something else that got discussed with some of the policy proposals on the Green New Deal that nobody wants to admit to, but it's there. But the other issue is we tend our fields using diesel-powered machinery. We generate electricity to run things for different places and using diesel-powered generators. This is an inherent problem. We're not going to have the manpower to just up and decide to work the fields with people. And without the diesel-powered tractor, how do you propose to do things like plow the field and harvest? Are we going to use animals, or are we going to hope that we can generate something comparable that's electric? Again, you're going to dump it on the electric grid. That's one problem. Also, something to consider: how does food get to the grocery store? Well, that's generally speaking on the back of trucks that are powered by diesel fuel. So you do your carbon tax, that's going to significantly drive up the cost of food. And if you don't believe me, take a look at the price of groceries anytime the price at the price at the pump for gasoline and diesel fuel goes up. And you'll notice your cost for groceries will go up as well, because that's how they get to and from the store, or from the warehouse to the store, excuse me. So again, this is an inherent problem. And if you ban diesel engines and dump the trucks on the electric grid, that's still more demand of the electric grid. And if you have a limited supply and a high demand, it's going to drive the cost up at a very minimum. You may end up with shortages, though. So at best, you're talking about higher food prices. And that's not going to be a tenable thing. If it gets to the point where people can't buy food at the store, there's going to be an awful lot of people that are going to be awfully desperate, because the average American is ill-equipped to fend for themselves if they can't go to the store and buy food. Most of us aren't farmers, and certainly those who are farmers are not doing subsistence farming. And for all those people who like to talk about how they're a woodsman and outdoorsman because they can hunt, there's a difference between hunting because you enjoy hunting as a hobby versus I need to shoot something because I'm hungry and my family's hungry, and if I don't get something, I'm screwed. Oh, and by the way, you're competing with everybody else who feels exactly the same way. That's what you're dealing with if the price of food gets so high people can't afford it. And if you want to see what that's like, have a look at the Weimar Republic, Germany, prior to World War II and prior to the rise of the Nazis. There's some stellar examples there of what can happen. And these are all things that nobody's talking about, nobody really considers. And I will absolutely criticize the Republicans for this too. Republicans want to talk about it in terms of global climate change is a myth. I think that's the wrong argument to have, but that's typical of the Republican Party because they always seem to want to make the wrong ask. They want to have and make the wrong argument. The problem is that assume that the Democrats have a point that it is a problem. It becomes, is the cure going to be worse than the disease? I think we have good historical evidence of what happens when you run up the cost of living too high, and it ain't good. I mean, I think there's a good argument to be made that Hitler and his Nazi party would not have been able to rise to power in Germany had it not been for the fact that Germany was so economically devastated. People got desperate and they voted for extremism. And they got it. It's a bad deal. On a more immediate thing, though, whether or not extremism would rise in this country, you start running the cost of food up to the point where people can't afford it, and people are going to die because they will starve to death. That is what you're talking about when you push these policies. You're talking about putting people out of work. And how about industries that depend on the current system? If you've been a coal miner all your life, and all of a sudden you're 40, you're in your 40s or 50s, getting towards the later part of your working life, and all of a sudden Joe Biden or somebody like him comes along and says, well, now it's climate change, so we're going to just shut your industry down. What are you supposed to do? This is what you've done your entire life, and you're now left to start over again. Your experience won't matter because you're a coal miner. Well, we don't need miners. We need programmers, and you're old enough that you're going to be applying for jobs from people that are younger than you. And that's a problem. You can put a lot of people out of work. I mean, it's just not, you cannot just expect to flip a switch. I think it's realistic we need to get away from fossil fuels because one problem that is undeniable is there's a finite supply in the world. And when it's gone, it's gone. And all of these problems I just talked about are going to be problems anyway. But it needs to be understood, and this is where I have a problem with the Democrats and Mr. Biden. It needs to be understood. This is not something you can just flip a switch and do. This would be, it took us over 100 years to build up the current infrastructure. There will be another 100 years before it will take at least some of that time to wind it down in the other direction. It's not something you can just flip a switch and throw money at to fix. And I'm really troubled by Mr. Biden proposing that AOC be put into his cabinet, or someone like her, to spearhead this, because it tells me that he just has no clue, and that he will absolutely fall in line with the extremists. This is a problem that really needs to get addressed in a manner that is thoughtful and that is planned out over the long term. It should be done in increments, not let's suddenly drop a huge carbon tax or let's start banning things. Because it should not be done in a reactive way. It should not be done in a punish the polluters. What you want is collaboration with industry, not punish industry. What you want is to encourage young people that work in coal mining communities to find another line of work, but do it in a manner that's not heavy-handed. And what you need to do, honestly, federal government is not going to solve this problem. The federal government does almost nothing well and does very few things competently. The federal government is really good at screwing things up. That is what it does well, is screw things up. This is something that we as a people, the American people, need to get together and figure out what to do about getting away from fossil fuels. That's what needs to happen. We do not need some top-down, heavy-handed federal nonsense to make that happen. It needs to happen from a desire by people who are motivated to innovate on their own, even if it's for profit. They need to be the ones to step up and take responsibility. We need less federal authority and more people deciding to deal with it on their own. Get together and be you want to take action on this. This is how you take action on this. Get together with some like-minded people, start your own business, and start making, invest in new technology, invest in innovation and research. And yes, it's risky. But if you don't like that private industry as it exists now is doing it, well, then that's something that if there's a need for it, as you believe there is, good. Go serve that need. Because no one else is, so you have no competition. But don't resort to these heavy-handed measures that are essentially going to come around to people and strip them of their livelihood because you're mad at industry. You don't like that people drive, and you live in an area where you can take the damn train, and you just don't get why anybody else doesn't take the damn train. Well, because we can't take the damn train. I would love to be able to take a commuter rail to work. I enjoy riding for fun. I could sit and write while I was on my way to work if I didn't have to drive. But guess what? It's not an option because there is no commuter rail. That's reality. It's not there. And it ain't going to be where I live because there aren't enough people to support it. So we need to get over that kind of fantasy. Let's think about realistically what we can do. My honest position would be I think nuclear should be revisited. Nuclear is an extremely efficient way of generating electricity. Pound for pound, you get more energy out of fissile uranium and plutonium than you do out of coal. It doesn't produce any emissions, and nuclear waste isn't the problem everybody says it is. There are ways of processing it. You can take spent fuel, process out the byproducts, and reuse it. It's a similar procedure to how they generated highly enriched uranium and plutonium for making bombs. And it's an old technology. There is some risk involved because of the fact that it can be dual used to make bombs. But this is a problem of let's work out better security solutions for the fuel, not let's not do it. And guys, if you want someone to blame for why we're not pursuing this technology, that would be President Obama, who put a stop to it. But these technologies exist. There's a reason why a lot of the rest of the world relies more heavily on nuclear than we do, and they don't have the problems with disposing of the waste. These are old technologies. They're technologies we have now. You want to get away from coal? Go to nuclear. Nuclear is always on. Now, admittedly, there's some places you probably don't want to build a reactor. Like, you might not want to build one in Southern California where they get earthquakes all the damn time. But you could build one further inland, like in, say, Nevada, and run cables out there so they have electricity. And yeah, you can supplement it with wind and solar. I have no problem with that. But thinking that they're going to be a panacea is just foolishness. And going around saying we're going to ban this and we're going to ban that and we're going to do it in this short amount of time, it's just not realistic. And you can listen to all the doom and gloom from the scientists all you want. And I mean, I'm not saying don't listen to the scientists. But these same scientists that do this never seem to offer a realistic solution to the problem. There's just ban, 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 ban. Banning is not a solution on the ground when you have people who are not going to be able to survive, literally not going to be able to survive if they can't go to the store and buy groceries. Now, maybe that's a problem with those people, and maybe those people need to learn to survive. But then realistically, with the population being what it is, we're not subsistence farming anyway. I mean, where in the hell are you going to build a subsistence farm in a city? I mean, honestly, where are you going to do that? You're not. You're just not. So that's not realistic anyway. We need to explore realistic solutions to this problem and understand it's not something you're going to get done overnight. It could be another 50 to 60 years or more before we really get away from fossil fuels. Well, I don't want to rant anymore on the subject. I think I've made my point. I think Mr. Biden means well on this. I think, as is typical of politicians, he has no clue what it really means to live in Middle America. And I don't just mean Middle America as in the inland states. I mean Middle America as in middle to, the working class of America that doesn't live in these big cities. That's Middle America. Just so that I'm being very clear. That's Middle America. And he has no idea. The man's wealthy. The people he surrounds himself with are wealthy. It's not a problem. I'll close by saying this. These politicians have no incentive to be that concerned about these things because they are insulated pretty heavily. None of their bad policies are not going to screw them up like they will screw the rest of us up because they're too wealthy and they're taken care of and protected. If you have to pay thousands of dollars for a loaf of bread, these assholes will be able to pay it. And they'll be at the front of the line because they're the leadership. They're going to be taken care of. The only reason they really are in danger is if they screw up so bad that we end up with like a nuclear war. And even then, they'll be at the front of the line for the bunker. So my point is, do not expect that these guys are going to sweep in and save the effing day like they say they will. Because the reality is, they have no idea. They don't understand how most of us live. They have no idea. So you're better off to get together with a lot of like-minded folks like yourself and fix it from the ground up if you really think it's a problem. And I don't mean by voting somebody into office. I mean by doing it yourself. Because that's how it's going to get done in a way that doesn't screw everybody over. And I think that's all I got to say on the subject. I'll be back later with another one. The next thing I'm going to talk about is going to be the so controversial topic of firearms and Mr. Biden. Anyway, thanks for listening. Bye.